All right. Welcome to Pan African Perspectives, your weekly live stream where we talk about all things Africa and Africa related. If you can hear me and you're watching this from anywhere in the world, wherever you're watching this from, give me a thumbs up so I know you can hear me, and also let me know where you're watching from. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up and let me know where you're watching from. So this is Pan African Perspectives. As I said, I'm your host, Joe Hotagua, and I'm the founder of Authentic African. Every week, we meet to discuss things affecting the continent of Africa, and all with the ultimate goal of advancing Africa and restoring it to its rightful place on the world stage. So my goal and my mission with this platform is to empower African people, whether your ancestors were trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade, if you are a foundational Black American, and if you find your way to Africa via your own means recently. So our mission is to support an independent Africa and empower African people. Like I said, I'm Joe Otago, your host, as I mentioned before. And each week I'll share my experiences living, traveling, and investing in Africa. So today we have a really special episode. I am going to be talking to a gentleman from Analysis Africa, which is a Spanish language Africa news platform. So shout out to Simo27 from California. Where's everybody watching from? We got DJ X-Ray from Los Angeles. Okay. We got Real Truth from Uganda. What's up? Ian Calvin is, I know one flag, the Nigerian flag. I don't know the other flag. We got Ebony Rose Diamond. What a name, from Texas. Victor Felton from Phoenix, Arizona. Ayafi? Wait, no, Ayahifi from Jamaica. Sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. We got Philip Richardson from Bermuda. We got a bunch of people from all over the world. So I appreciate you guys joining. We got Mokanji Film Production from Switzerland is watching. All right, cool. So we're going to get into this interview really quickly. I'm excited to share it. I will say it was unexpected. You know, it was a conversation that kind of was wide ranging, and I didn't know what to expect. And so I think we should just get right into it. It's worth just getting into it. So let's just do that real quick.
Can you tell us about yourself, please?
Good afternoon. And I would say mucho gusto. I don't speak much Spanish, but I took some Spanish in school. So my name is Joannis. Some people call me Joe Hotagua. I am a Sierra Leonean American who spent 8 years and continue to invest and travel around the continent of Africa. I also spent 4 years living in West Africa, so between Ghana and Sierra Leone. I'm building a house as we speak. I have acres of land, and I have another town lot, and I'm also looking to expand on my real estate endeavors in Sierra Leone and in Ghana and other places on the continent of Africa. So that is where I am now in terms of who I am personally. I've also built a platform called Authentic African, as you referenced. My platform is about helping people do a number of different things, but the main thing is to educate Africa and the diaspora so that we can come together, unify our forces, and we can build a better Africa and build a better environment for Africans in the diaspora and somewhere else that they can invest their funds and their money and just have other options outside of the United States if they so choose. Platform Authentic African, through the content that you see, whether it's on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, all the different platforms, little over 500,000 followers on Instagram, and then Facebook 100,000. So overall, we're approaching 1 million followers across all platforms. And the goal there is to get people to do 3 things: visit, invest, and or move to the continent of Africa. And so that's my goal, is to share information between the 2 groups and to get people to take action so that you can have better personal financial circumstances as someone who's investing, and also help uplift the continent of Africa and get its rightful place on the world stage. Because it wasn't too long ago that Africa was capital of the world, and transatlantic slave trade and other things that changed. And so we working to get ourselves back to that place, because we do have all the minerals underground, and most countries do not exist without the mineral exploitation of the continent of Africa. So that's a little bit about myself, what I care about and what I'm focused on.
And how do you come up with the authentic African platform or media?
That's a great question. So back in 2019, I had just come back from Sierra Leone for the fourth time in 2 years. Actually, the fifth time in 2 years. And at that time, I had an apartment where I would have get-togethers often. And I had carvings from Sierra Leone. You'd have Sierra Leoneans that do great carving. So I had these masks that I would hang up, these carvings that I'd put around my apartment. And I had a event there, a little bit of a get-together. And someone there asked me about one of the carvings. They asked me how much I would charge them to purchase the carving from me. And I came up with a number. They thought it was a fair amount. I realized that there was an ability to potentially turn this into a business. So in the beginning, the idea was really just focused on getting products made on the continent of Africa, ethically sourced, and making sure they were available to people in the diaspora that were looking to get closer to their roots and wanted to purchase these items. Before launching the e-commerce store and everything surrounding the commerce, I thought it would be important in order to drive traffic and to bring people to the store, to be offering something of value, to be teaching people about what's happening on the continent of Africa, teaching people about the stories, the news, and what's happening on the continent. And then I also realized it would be helpful to teach people on the continent what's happening in the diaspora, especially in the States. And so I grew up as a culturally American person with two African parents. I heard both sides talking about the other. I heard Africans talking about the diaspora, and I heard the diaspora talking about Africans. And I realized that there was a disconnect between the knowledge that they had about what each was going through currently and historically, these historical figures that helped us all get to the place that we are today. And so I began to focus on sharing that knowledge through the platform. The name Authentic African came from, 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm trying to think of a name, African exports. And then I realized if it's stuff made on the continent of Africa, and I'm going to be doing content about Africa and African news, it can be authentic African news, authentic African carvings. The name just seemed to work with anything you want to put after it. And so I don't call myself authentic African, even though I'm living an authentic African experience whenever I go to the continent, and even as an American African. So that is kind of the name came together. It stuck. Logo came from that. As soon as I saw the name, the logo made sense because it's authentic. So it's like a stamp. And then I use the Pan African flag colors because it's about Pan Africanism, right? And the development of Africa and Africans in the diaspora. And so that's how the logo and the branding all came to be under the umbrella of Authentic African.
So since you grew up in the United States, let me ask you a question about the Black experience in America, because you hear many stories. There is the people called FBA or ADOS, Foundational Black America, or Americans Descendants of the Slaves. They say that those people who don't come from the continent, in the Caribbean, they have a totally different experience. Is it true or is it not true?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. So it's a loaded question. So let's put those two definitions, right? So foundational Black Americans, many people who fall under this category or who consider themselves to fall under this category. These are folks who feel like they came to the Americas outside of the slave trade. A portion of their heritage is that. There are many Europeans who talk about like Black Africans when they came here. So there's some disputes about how this group got here. Is it the original humans who migrated from the continent of Africa and were in what is now North America? Is it from Mansa Musa's father, who there are stories about him sailing, multiple west, and that is how they got there? But that's the foundational Black Americans. Then you have the ADOS, which is the African Descendants of Slavery. Those two groups are the groups that I think make up of what was originally called Black Americans, or no, originally called Afro-Americans or Negroes in America. And now many of them have disparate groups that they kind of fall on how they want to describe themselves, and how they identify. Their experience, many first generation Americans' experience, are similar outside the home. So once I walked out into the street, and I went to a boarding school as well, but had I grown up at home with my parents, it would be the same thing. Once you walk out into the streets, you are a Black American. So how the police engage with you, how people engage with you, is based on their experience about how they see Black Americans, whether that's through television and film, whether it's through their own personal experiences. That is going to be how people perceive you, is based on how you look, right? What they understand about you. So as a person who's a first generation American, outside the home, my experience was very similar to almost everybody else that I would come across who was also either a foundational Black American or ADOS. So FBA or ADOS, or versus a first generation American, our experience is all the same outside. I think what made different is your experience inside the household. Now that for me, as someone who culturally is American. Now, for those of the Caribbean descent, and who move to the United States, and those of African descent who migrate to the United States, they tend to have more upward mobility than many people who are multi-generationally in the United States. Now, there are many different reasons why people argue for this. I think it's much more simple than the argument that's out there. I think the reason why they have more upward mobility is because when you are traveling to a new country, it requires you to save a significant amount of money. So the process of saving is something you've already gone through. That's number one. Number two, it requires a significant amount of research. And you have to jump through many hoops to even go through the legal process of becoming a citizen. So prior to the internet, right, people were doing a lot of different types of research. With the internet, there's a little bit easier to find research, but it requires a lot of work to get here. There's also the dream of always wanting to get here, right? So there's seeing America as the destination for your dreams are going to come true. Many people who were born and raised here don't see that because their environment led them to see America as a place where it's against me and it's going to be difficult for me to get what I want, right? So I think they're both coming to how the United States is from different perspectives. And so I think that causes a difference in upward mobility generally in terms of the larger groups of folks. So there are many upwardly mobile Black people. In fact, Black Americans, the numbers are there of like $3 trillion in worth in just America, Black Americans. But it's what it's spent, right? It does the money doesn't stay in, right? It's 6 hours in the Black community, 24 hours sometimes in other communities, right? Sometimes weeks and continuously in other communities. But with the Black community, it's a short amount of time. So I think that when there are people of the United States of race, the idea of immigrants, at this point in time in America, immigrants have a negative view in America, especially for those who's been disenfranchised in America. So you have a disenfranchised of all races who see immigrants as the reason for the right. You'll hear a lot, these people are taking jobs, right? I think the challenge with that is that most immigrants take are either ones that most Americans don't want to do. So that means that's like hard labor out in the sun, many hours a day for less money. They're usually getting exploited as immigrants. Or they're highly skilled jobs that required level of education before coming here, new education and advanced education that those people do when they get here. So generally the people who are most disenfranchised, their argument is that it's the immigrants that are doing it. And generally it's not the immigrants that are disenfranchising them. It's actually the elites that are disenfranchising them. And they want you to believe it's the immigrants or other people of color. So you fight each other and don't pay attention to what they're doing. And so I think that is probably why there's been this disconnect between these folks, the ADOS, the FBAs, Africans who moved to the continent, because there's been that viewpoint of immigrants. Now, let me speak to immigrants. There have been many immigrants who have come to America, and because of the way the news covers crime, violent crime, and things that are happening, that there are so many people of ill intent, so many Black people, Black Americans who have ill intent and that are committing many of the crimes that are happening. And in general, although it may be a higher percentage of certain types of crime, most violent crime actually happens from non-minorities, many times more, in fact, in terms of the total number of violent crimes. And then in terms of those who are convicted, people of color generally are, I think, 2 times more likely to have a conviction overturned for being wrongly convicted, because most of the time they are wrongly accused of a crime that they didn't commit. Right. So I think there were just these numbers and these facts that the groups don't know, which is why Authentic African is really focused on trying to share that kind of information between these two groups. So instead of seeing us as different, we see each other as a part of the same group that can work together to advance ourselves everywhere we are in the world, and not as in siloed groups. And so as a long way to explain it, but I think it's important because I think these things are just so flippantly discussed, and there isn't a nuanced conversation. It's almost always people feel like they have to be in their own corner, right? You'll find some of the people in FBA, and not even most, but will say that, you know, we have to just focus on FBA. You'll have some folks who are Africans say we just need to focus on Africans, and then you have some folks who are ADOS and say we need to focus on ADOS. And I think that we should not be siloed. We should be together and working together to build a better societies around the world, and build more wealth for ourselves within our communities. And we need to work together to do that. And that's what Authentic African is about.
Yeah, I got a few questions for you. What do you think
Sure.
who those who say, well, the Africans or Blacks from other parts of the world, let's say Latin America, they didn't go through the civil rights movement. They didn't go through segregation. They didn't go through slavery, at least here in the United States. So of course they come with an economic advantage. Do you think that is true?
I think that is ill-informed, right? So because the transatlantic slave trade wear them off, right? So in some cases they were all over the Caribbean, where, by the way, governments, the Caribbean itself is not better off than in terms of financially, right? The United States' dollar is the highest. So the Caribbeans that were dropped off in the Caribbeans that are all former Africans, right, just lived their lives in the Caribbean. The Americans, the foundational Black Americans, or even those ADOS especially, it's just where they were dropped off. It was the triangle trade. So some of them were dropped in Brazil, some of them were dropped in other parts of Latin America, some of them were dropped in the Caribbean, and then others were brought here to the Americas. The situation for all of them is very similar. So that's the Caribbean and the United States, right? Because it's just where they were dropped off in the slave trade. The slave trade still did happen on the continent of Africa, by the way. Europeans did keep slaves on the continent of Africa, or enslaved Africans on the continent of Africa. But also the disenfranchisement of Africans have been happening since the Berlin Conference, and even before that, when Europeans split up Africa into their own territories and started peeling away the natural resources, right? So there are no specific economic advantages for any one group of people. I think what it is what you find is that there are folks who make the move to the United States. They themselves may have some work to have some economic advantages, like to build a business and to do some things in their current country. They can generate enough revenue to move to the United States, but that is not the general life of those living in those places. Just like generally most Black Americans are in environments that they would like to see improved. It's the same way in the Caribbean, it's the same way on the continent of Africa. In fact, I would argue on the continent of Africa, some of the poverty is even, 2 times worse than what you might find in the United States. For example, the average income per month is $50 a month. In Ghana, it's about $75 per month. That is the average income per person. I don't know what it is in Caribbean countries, but I do know in the United States, the average income is about $30-something thousand a year. Now, the cost of living is different in the United States versus it is in these countries. But that amount that people make is not enough to be able to live right at above the poverty line or at the poverty line in the United States in their respective countries. And I think that is a common misnomer because, again, the elites of the United States want people here to fight against other people instead of thinking about how they're making things better for themselves. So they continue to parrot talking points that the elites make available to them, and they don't even realize they're parroting talking points from those who want to keep them suppressed.
Yes, I wanted to touch on that because me as an African as well, it's really difficult to get to the United States. Some people fake documents, or you think about it, for example, now we're in 2025. You think that you're moving to the United States in 2027 or 28. You just don't wake up one day and do it.
Right.
You usually save a lot of money, You sell your belongings. When you go to interview, you let the people in the bank to lie about fake bank statements. It's not that it's, you know how they live. If they come to you just for a passport and then go back to the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the elites everywhere, their goal is to maintain their power, maintain their status. And they're always going to pit people against each other so you don't see what they're doing. It's like a magician that has sleight of hand, right? They do a lot of movement over here. So you're watching that, you have no idea what they're doing over here. And that is how the wealthy and the elite do things all around the world. It's like, watch this hand, don't watch this one. And so, I mean, I think that's the issue. And so, to your point, there are people who skirt this, I think, have caused a challenge with the immigration in general, right? If you have people who are finding a way illegally to our country, what it does is it angers those who did the right process to enter a country. And so that group to get bundled in with the group that's doing illegally. And so you find that group is against the group that does it illegally. And then you have other folks who want to spend some time, who don't really understand how immigrant groups are upset about the illegal immigrant groups seeking asylum. That's something that I think people tend to be upset about, especially Latin groups in the United States, right? Many people who are like second generation, third generation, or even first generation that moved to the United States and gone through all of the hard processes to become an American citizen, they even vote for people who might be against the idea of illegal immigration because they feel like that illegal immigration is making them look bad. And so you see that a lot in the Latin American community in particular, especially here in New York, where these people may be progressive in terms of their thought processes and may lean left on the political spectrum, but they might have voted the right side of the political spectrum, meaning left versus right, so conservative, because the conservative side of the political spectrum talks about removing illegal immigrants. So it was confusing to many people who are in politics on the left side, because they're thinking all the immigrants are going to want to support the other immigrants, but what actually happened. And I think that's something that Democrats in America have to at some point come to terms with, that there were people who actually flipped sides, who went to the Republican side because didn't want to be associated with those other immigrants who came illegally. Again, it's all about the elites making you think that these people are your enemy, when it's really they're the ones who are continuing to build wealth and do what they want to maintain their power.
The last question before we move on to the next topic. What do you think about the image of Black people in America? Do you think it will change, or the damage has been already done? You see rap music, you see American History X, how the Black guys got stepped in the head. You think it will change, or not? It will stay like this forever? Because I mean, we've been conditioned to be seen as thugs.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, a nuanced answer. I was export from right. American culture is the #1 export from America. You see K-pop, you see different kinds of music all around the world that has American influence, right? Even the way people dress, right? So I think it's really important to know that American culture is mostly Black culture, right? Country music was started by Black people. Pop music, hip hop music. But when it becomes commercialized, people of European descent get into those musics, but it's still Black culture that is what is permeating across society around the world. So it's interesting, right? Because there's the cultural aspect that everyone is mimicking or utilizing or even dressing like, but there's the imagery that many people have who are maybe older and elite, or who speak to imagery of who Black people are in terms of the negatives. So I think over time, there will be a slight shift because as culture permeates around the world, as people tend to see more examples of a different type of Black person, I do think that at some point in time that will shift ever so slightly. But bigotry and racism will always exist. And so you're not going to ever be able to change everyone's minds around the world. There are always going to be people who have those belief systems. But I do think as those people of color move up through the ranks, are able to make more movies, are able to make more television series, are able to tell their stories, I think you will start to see a slight shift, but it will never be a place where Black people will be seen as a full spectrum. I think for the most part, people will expect that there are some that are good. They'll probably think that there are most that are bad. There's been a lot of damage that have been done to lead to that. So I'm optimistic that there will be a shift, enough of a shift where the Overton window moves and where we can, where in America, Black Americans can feel proud of how they're seen around the world. But I don't think that there will ever be a complete shift amongst all minds around the world, because there's too much has been done by the music that is purchased today and that is played today. It's the most commercial, right? Like what is going to generate them is going to be what is going to be, and bad news travels faster than news. And so people do tend to a little bit more aggressive in tone that depicts a certain kind of light. And so it'll be challenging for people who've never visited America, who've never met a Black American, there's a wide spectrum. What happens a lot, even for myself, is when I meet people, even in America, when I meet people here, they think I'm an exception, not the rule. They think that there aren't enough people like me. They think that my parents must both or lawyers, or I come from like an elite class, because they don't understand that someone like me who's come from immigrants who came to America, who lived humbly, can actually sound what they think are some of the elites in their world, right? So it's going to take some time. I think that there will be a slight shift. I don't think you'll ever be able to change everyone's, but I do think we will be able to move in the right direction as more and more folks like us who continue to have these conversations continue to. But I think what we have to remember is that our goal is to build ourselves, not to make them see us differently. I think if we continue to build as a group, that will eventually happen, but you can't change how someone else thinks. You can only control what you do yourself. And so I think that's my answer to that. A long way to get there, but that's what I believe.
It's all right. And I can agree with that. I can agree. I've been to the United States, and when people heard me talk the first time, they got dumbfounded. Wow. I was like, hey, we are like over 1 billion Black people. We are like 1.3, 1.4, 1 million Black people. So
right.
You get the ones that speak Spanish that tell me when they speak English.
Exactly.
Let's move to the next topic. Let's say you're a Black guy from, let's say, Brooklyn. You didn't have things your way. And he's like, he hits you up and he says, hey, Joe, I want to move back to the continent. What could you tell him?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of things that I tell people. Number one, I say first do your research on where you want to go. Visit first. So it's always visit, invest, move. So visit first and see what makes sense for you, but do your research before you visit. What country makes the most sense for you? If you're looking for a tie to your potential homeland, maybe do a DNA test and you can see where your potential homeland might have been. You might want to choose that you feel like you're more likely to have a smoother transition. I would also say ensure that that will allow you to move, because generating income and starting a new business in a completely different place where you have to do new research, regardless of if you're in that industry already, is going to be an uphill battle. It's very difficult to start all over in a new place. So do your research, visit first, visit multiple times, and visit extended periods of time. I made the mistake of moving after spending 4 days in Ghana. Now, I'd been traveling back and forth to Sierra Leone often. I spent 4 days in Ghana, but within 12 months, I moved to Ghana full time. Now, I was lucky enough to get a job within 3 months of moving, and then I had another job again. Had I done other things to ensure I had income and a continuous income, I would not have had to move back to the United States, back to my old career, to ensure I have income to invest more in assets so that the next time I go, I can go without ever having to come back. I can travel back and forth if I want to, but it won't be a need in order to. So again, do your research to find a country or countries. travel and visit as often as possible, stay for at least a month at a time and have a few visits. Then from there, just making sure you have a residual form of income that'll allow you to move and to be able to live comfortably when you make that move. You cannot make the decision to move to another continent and to another country on that continent on a whim. It's going to require some additional research first. So just like we were talking about earlier, how immigrants who are planning to come to America, they start planning 2-3 years in advance. You want to do the same thing as someone who's planning to move to the continent. You cannot just make a move right away. There are some people who've made a quick move, started a business, and within 2 years, they're making more money on the continent than they ever made. Those stories are very, very rare. It's more likely that you're going to need to have a form of income that's residual, that does not matter where you are in order to live on the continent. Or at the very least, you'll have to have a remote job that'll allow you to work there. And you'll be able to set up yourself with internet and all those kinds of things to be able to do that. So that's the advice I would give to someone who wants to move to the continent.
But let's say, do you think all people who are Black from the United States should move to Africa or not? Or it would damage the United States?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I care if it would damage the United States, to be honest. I think the United States has done enough to damage Black people. I really am not sure if all Black people leave, that would have any issue. And I mean, I don't know if Americans care. But what I would say is, I think there's a saying that people in the South of America say, not all skin folk is kinfolk. And what I mean by that, for those of you who are listening, is like, just because we're all Black doesn't mean we're all family. Marcus Garvey used to saying, like, I don't want all people, because not everybody is good. We don't want everybody. Like, I also want to mention that there are more people who are educated, who about the advancement of our people and all those kinds of things that are Black. There are parts of society. Every group has a percentage of us that are not, in terms of how they react and how they act. And so those folks, I don't want to go to the continent. Also, I do think with mass migrations comes gentrification. And what that does is that now makes it more difficult for the native people of that area to survive, because it increases the prices of everything. So a slower migration over time is probably best for the continent itself, because not everywhere can handle that many people coming in with that many issues. Causing that many issues in terms of the increases in rent prices, the increases in food prices, the increases in transportation, fuel, everything. Because with more demand, it increases the supply, right? And so there are no infinite in terms of housing and things like that. So all of that stuff that go up, the people that migrate. So I'm actually more concerned about mass migration affecting the continent of Africa than migration affecting the United States. And so I'd love to see all the right people moving for all the right reasons. But I do know that we're already seeing it in Ghana right now, where some of that is causing some challenges for the locals, where the price increases have gone up tremendously since 2019, because so many people are moving now. So that's, I think, a concern of mine. I do see that concern, and I do think that is something that we have to consider as we are all making the move to other countries or thinking about move. And how do we ensure that we are benefiting the communities we're moving to, and supporting businesses to ensure that the local businesses can remain open and they can remain viable places for people to work.
Because, I mean, this question that I ask you has many. Say you got 3 Black people, one from Brazil, one from Jamaica, and one from the United States. What would you recommend to move to Africa, any African country?
I think it depends on where you're from, and more depends on your mindset, right? And what you're focused on. Because I could say all 3 should move if they want to diversify they want to see a betterment of the continent of Africa, and also better themselves financially with buying and building assets. Who I think is more likely to have a smoother transition, probably someone from Brazil or somewhere else in Latin America, because those are emerging societies, right? Those are all developing. And so you will be moving from one developing country to another developing country. So you may have a smoother transition moving from one to another. the United States is considered a developed country already in the developed world. It might be harder to transition moving from the United States to any country on the continent of Africa, and specifically many of the places in West Africa that I talk about.
Okay. Also, I got this other question. Imagine somebody who is fresh out of jail wants to start fresh. Would you recommend him go back to the continent?
That's a tough one because it's all going to be dependent whether or not you can make an income, right? So, you know, I think depends on what business ideas you have and whether or not you can generate income. If you have been fully rehabilitated and your goal is to move to the continent and focus on businesses, legitimate businesses, then I would recommend that's one place that you can go, but you have a lot of learning that you will have to do, right? But it depends, right? Because there are many people who are released from prison. The ones who are found guilty, we have a high recidivism rate, meaning people go back to prison because they go back doing this thing. Many people who go to prison learn how to do the thing that they were doing better because they're surrounded by many other people who have committed other such crimes, right? And so those are not the folks I want to see going to Africa, right? But there are folks that are wrongly convicted, are folks who've gone for like non or people who have been rehabilitated through the process. And those people, I think, are some of the right kind of people. So it all depends on the individual. I don't think there's one answer. It really always depends on the individual and what the individual is looking to do. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to see people get a second chance, right? If you've really been rehabilitated, I'd like to see people get a second chance. If you were wrongly convicted, I'd like to get a second chance. Because unfortunately, in the United States, if you're a felon, when you're applying for a job, you have to mention that you had a felony. And there's a study that was done. I just watched this the other day. This is going to be an interesting fact for folks. There was a random group of individuals applying for different jobs. And it was folks who didn't have a criminal conviction and those who applied who said they had a criminal conviction. And it was amongst white people and Black people. What they found is that 45% of white people were offered those jobs in this particular study. 17% who had the convictions were offered jobs. The interesting thing is, with the Black people, 14% without criminal convictions were offered the jobs. 5% with criminal convictions were offered their jobs. That's stating that white people with criminal convictions fared the same or better than Black people without criminal convictions. Right now, it's one study. It's not all of America, but it was one study that was done. And in that study, what you found is 17% versus 14%, right? 14% of the Black people got the jobs, 17% of the white people who had said they committed a crime. Because this was people who hadn't actually had criminal convictions. It was for the study. And so that's what they found. I found that to be interesting. That's what you need to know about how people of color are perceived in this country, right? So if you have the chance to start all over again and go somewhere else, by all means, I say to do it, but you have to have a number of things in place before you do it to ensure success.
And the reason I gave you the example of Brazil, Jamaica, and United States, because imagine you're a Jamaican. He will tell you, okay, Joe, why would I go back? I'm a majority in my country. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But then if you're a Black guy, let's say from Arkansas, you might be thinking, okay, I'm tired of this. You know what I mean? I'm tired of the struggle. But if you might be thinking, okay, I'm tired of the struggle, plus I'm in a poor country. Because you see many African Americans that go to Brazil and they have a skewed view of how is Brazil. Right. It's because they go with American dollars. So of course they don't feel the same. And they don't live the same favelas lives. Do you agree with?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, but that also is a specific group of Black people who to travel, right? So I do think that is a different element. So yeah, I mean, I think those who are planning to the country and go somewhere else depends on that. That's why it always depends on the person, right? Because many of those travel to Brazil, they're Black Americans, the way the majority of Black Americans are living in America, right? So these are people who have some form of privilege, whether through their own work, who have moved up the socioeconomic ladder and who are financially able to afford those kinds of trips. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right about that. There are probably folks in the United States that it might seem like they'll have a better opportunity to be one of many, as opposed to just being only one. And so they may have different reasons for leaving. But I wouldn't say there's one person over another to go. I think their reasons may be different, but I don't say I would prefer one or another, because again, it's based on who they are and what they're about. Who I say should go to the continent of Africa, not their current circumstances in America. Their current, or wherever they are, their current circumstances might determine why they want to leave. But my thought process on who I want on the continent of Africa is based on what they want to do there, not why they want to leave. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand that. And this takes us to okay, we're in Africa, we're getting some people from the diaspora. Do you think it will bring Pan-Africanism together? Because I see Pan-Africanisms, it's in the mouth of the civil society, but the politics, in the politics that run in the countries, they're still not engaging into it. What do you think that is?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, and for those who are watching, right, just wanted to do that as a Pan-Africanist. So it is a nationalist movement that aims to encourage and strengthen bonds of solidarity between all indigenous peoples, diasporas, and African ancestry. So I wanted to give that definition first, because people hear it, but they don't always know it. So that's number one. Generally, the Pan-Africanist on the continent of Africa that people might remember are Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya for quite some time, Thomas Sankara, and there are many others, but those are the three that people kind of know, the most. Now, the reason why it is very difficult to get to that utopia of a United States of Africa, where Africa is 50 states and it's one big country instead of 54 disparate countries, is because of each country into territories of European countries. So there are language barriers, right? So you have countries that are neighboring each other where they have their local tribal languages, but the language that they all speak amongst the tribes is a European language. So, for example, Sierra Leone is covered 3/4 of it, around it is Guinea, which is a French-speaking country. Sierra Leone is an English-speaking country. Liberia is an English-speaking country. You have countries like Cote d'Ivoire, French-speaking, but then you have Ghana, that's English-speaking. Then you have Benin and Togo that are French-speaking, and then you have Nigeria that's English-speaking. So neighboring countries have this challenge where there's different languages. Also, throughout history, in the process of gaining their independence from European rule, many of them built up a national identity within these countries. So instead of the normal tribal identities that they had previously, it's now national identities under the former European borders that were built. And people always want to preserve their borders, and people want to preserve their national identity now instead of their cultural or their tribal identities. So it's a challenge because, number one, where would the capital of Africa be? Right? What would the language of Africa be? So these are all questions we have to ask ourselves. Now, I've talked about this in some ways. I've said there's a possibility that there are these that will form, and maybe eventually when these federations form, you may be able to turn those into countries, and then you may be able to bring them. So for example, there's an East African Federation right now that they're talking about forming, where the folks, and they all have a common language of Kiswahili. You go to Uganda, you go to Kenya, you go to Tanzania, many of them speak Kiswahili, and they have other languages that they speak. In West Africa, you have different versions of Pidgin languages. So like in Nigeria, they have Pidgin. Sierra Leone, we have Creole. Ghana has their own version of Pidgin. But the challenge is these French countries that don't have that Pidgin language, right? So I think it's going to be challenging because if you speak languages, it's harder to come together as a group, right? And then if you have these groupings that feel like they're disparate, it's challenging. What I think will help to get us to at least working together as a continent is watching what's happening in the Sahel states, or the AES, with Mali, Burkina Faso, and if these leaders remain in power and aren't overthrown by coups that are sponsored by outside powers, let's say, and they continue to have the success they've been having, I think other countries may follow suit, because they all had coups in their countries. And in those coups, the three of those groupings came together and said, we're build an AES. We got a joint passport now. They have a joint flag. They call themselves like one confederation. They are working towards building collective bargaining amongst each other to have better trade deals with Europe, to have better trade deals with other folks. That will, if that works and that experiment works out over the next 50 years or so, see how that goes. It's a long time these things are going to take, right? I mean, this doesn't happen like overnight. You'll start other folks do something similar. You have the Economic Community of West African States. Right now, it is all trying to work together, but they don't always jointly negotiate, or Russia or France or with the United States. Even though there are one grouping of 15 or so different countries, 14 or so countries, they all still operate their own agreements, which is a challenge for all of them coming together and collectively bargain. So I think what we see with the AES, depending on how successful that is, I'd be something that other people can do. But until then, you have different people who are focused on themselves, many leaders who care about their own personal income. It's going to be very difficult for them to want to work with other folks because there's also egos associated with it, right? How do you get to a place where everybody agrees that there's one capital of Africa? How do you get to a place where everybody agrees that there's one language on the continent? That will be a challenge. So I don't know if we'll get to that place, but I do think what we'll have is, I think the more we work together, where we do interviews like this, we have conversations like this, I think it starts to develop us where folks are starting to realize that we can work better together than apart. And at the very least, we can start to work towards a Pan-African lifestyle and ideology. We may not get to the end goal in our lifetimes. That's my belief system.
I agree with that. We might not have United States of Africa like in a snap, but we could unite politically. For example, when the coup happened in the Sahel, why didn't any African foreign minister of, let's say, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, these Eastern countries, why didn't they send their how do you say that, their emissaries there? Why didn't they send ministers there to support them? You know what I mean? Sometimes Pan-Africanism is we are not a family. It's about supporting politically.
Yeah, that's the point. And I can tell you why they didn't do it, because they were afraid of coups in their own countries, right? Yeah, because think about it, it's generally just military leaders deciding to take over. Sometimes it's sponsored by outside. That's what a normal coup is. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, it's more like a revolution. The people wanted that. So it was the people who agreed to it. In fact, the people are the ones maintaining the leaders in power. The people of Burkina Faso, they have almost like a night watch where people are volunteering themselves they communicate to what's happening with the juntas or with the leaders of those countries, saying, look, we are people trying to come up with a coup. We'll make sure you know, because we want you to stay in power because you're changing our country for the better. Many of the other leaders across the continent of Africa are not looking to build coalitions amongst the people for what they want. Many of them are continue to maintain their wealth. And so that's why many of them did not support what was happening in the AES, because they were afraid it would happen to their own countries. That's my belief system.
I can see that, but let's say you're a country with a strong political system. Let's say you're South Africa. Why didn't they send their emissary or their Ministry of Foreign Affairs there? You know what I mean? Because that would show that a South African country has the support. You know what I mean?
I agree.
Nigeria is like right next to Niger. They share a land border together.
They share a border, yes. Yes.
So maybe I'm wrong, but so far I don't think any foreign African country has visited that Sahel area yet.
So Ghana. So they haven't visited, but the new president of Bahama, he met with Ibrahim Traore and spoke glowingly of him when they met in Ghana and talked about how they're working on partnerships. Apparently Senegal as well, because it would be the one that these three countries access to the ocean. So there was some conversations and questions about whether or not Senegal will go the way of previous administrations, or would they go the way of supporting more the AES. There's differences in opinion there, but it seems like he's with the folks and has an AES and has at the very least spoke positively about what they're doing in those countries. And so they've talked about potentially having trade partnerships and actually doing it. But you're right. I mean, there's 54 countries and 54 countries as recognized internationally. Sounds like maybe have had a conversation publicly and talked about how they're going to work with them. But again, I think it's because even if you have a strong political government, you know that population isn't about how things are going in those countries. And you see that many of them suppress dissent. They suppress a lot of the civil unrest, right? When people do, when they march for freedoms and things like that. Many country leadership are not happy about that. And so I think that's part of the reason why there's also a fear that where they have partnerships who are opposed to what's happening in the AES, they may be afraid that they may lose some of that the goodwill they have with some of those outside of the continent partnerships if they were to support what's happening there. And so there's two things. They may be afraid of their own people, and they also might be afraid of the partnerships they have outside of the continent, and they want to keep those partnerships intact. They don't want to necessarily support what's happening in the AES, because the way it's reported in all of our news is as if it was a bad thing in the AES. Like if you listen to the news in America and Europe and France, they talk about what's happening in the AES as if bad. But if you talk to the people on the ground, the people in Africa, everywhere around Africa, they support what's happening there. So that's the interesting thing.
Everybody in Africa, I think politically, Pan Africanism is dead. You saw Bola Tinubu from Nigeria. He was in France like three weeks ago or 1 month ago. And I believe Macron told him, hey, please do not give these people access to seawater, access to a seaport, because otherwise I might not give you, let's say, $30 million to your account. So let's keep on with the Pan Africanism. So politically it's crossed out. What about economic system? We have, I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, so tough, right? Because I think the number is something like 60% of people on the continent of Africa are unbanked. They don't have bank accounts. Much of the finances are transferred back and forth through the mobile monetary systems. On the continent of Africa have like many banking systems where you can pay people through mobile money or through cash. So there are many different to challenge cross-border and within countries. You find companies that are really well getting big finances. You have all these different companies that have raised a ton of money. They're working on these processes. I think that's one challenge, the currencies. I think also the issue is that all of these countries, their debt is in a foreign currency. And their currency, almost every country, to have challenges because that's in a foreign currency, their currency tends to fluctuate, but generally go down in value over time. So I think what it's going to take is collective work. So it sounds like ECOWAS is working on common currency. So the countries that are involved in the Economic Community of West African States, I may not have said that before, that what ECOWAS stands for, they're looking to start a common currency. And it looks like most of the countries in ECOWAS are agreeing to that. If they have a common currency, just like in Europe, you have the euro, right? If you work together, it can help support the countries that are not doing as well, and then you can work together to build outwardly, right? Right? England is the European Union, euro. Now they're back to the pound, if I'm not mistaken. And the pound is pretty strong still, but the economy seems to be faltering because of that happened all under that common currency. Once you have a common currency, it's a lot easier to trade between countries because your currency is a more stable currency that everybody can operate off of instead of operating in these different currencies when your borders are, you can see across the border. There's no real border. It's an artificial border. Right. So I do think that with common currencies in these groups, that'll likely help with economic advancement. But that's just one step. I think once you do that, you have better trade amongst the countries. And I think overall, that has an increase in the way that, the economies all around the continent will do. But again, these are slow processes and they will take long, but we are taking steps in the right direction.
Because imagine the United States gets mad at, let's say, 5 African countries. The United States says, hey, you don't have the SWIFT. What are they going to do now? You know what I mean? You think you see countries like Russia and China, which are big and powerful. Of course, maybe that's a bad, example. That I'm looking for different ways to counter the dollar. Doesn't mean we have to get out from the dollar completely because we'll collapse, but slowly.
Absolutely, I
Don't you
agree, and
agree?
I think I agree. I think one of the big issues that I think the United States is seeing, will be continuing to see, is the U.S. has done a lot of work in different countries in terms of humanitarian aid, and through doing that, a lot of America, right? I think a lot of that is going away moving forward, just based on the rhetoric we hear from the White House. And so that can have two different impacts. One, it can force the continent of Africa to work together better and to work on solutions. But also it will isolate, I think, the United States from many of the continent of Africa. And I think they will probably look to other folks for better deals, and Russia, which is what is happening currently with AES, for example, any other around the continent of Africa. I think that ideally Africa becomes more independent, but works together to have better trade deals with everyone, whether it's the West or the Far East. Ideally we work together, because all the minerals that the world uses comes from Africa. I mean, we're talking about everything that's in your iPhone. We're talking about the devices, the laptop I'm talking on, the light that I used that kept going off, the battery power that's in that comes from the continent of Africa. Majority of them used. Unfortunately, because Africa doesn't have and doesn't work together, the deals that Africa is getting it's disenfranchising the continent. It's making a few people rich and wealthy while the rest are suffering. And so I do think that there needs to be more collective bargaining and working together so that the continent of Africa can advance, for sure.
Who do you think will be more united Africa? United States, Russia, France, or the UK?
I think France, because here's why I think so. A good amount of France's economy is because they are, first of all, they're charging to countries that are former colonies. They are charging reparations for themselves, right? France is generating billions of dollars in reparations from Haiti and other places from their economies. France also has the first refusal in many countries that are former colonies. So if a country wants to do a deal with China, France has to be involved first and say yes or no. The UK doesn't have those kinds of deals. The United States doesn't have those kinds of deals in Africa. So although they might be disappointed, they will feel like they have less control over what's happening in these regions. I think the people that will be most devastated economically would be France, which is why Macron made the statements that he's made about the AES and African leaders, because what he's seeing is that there's beginning to be a separation and a formation of groupings in Africa that are going to be defiant to France. And I think that is going to have a serious impact on the France economy and France in general, because they have no minerals. So they don't really have much to offer. If I'm not mistaken, they don't have oil. They definitely don't have any of the minerals that you have on the continent of Africa. So what do you have if you don't have those things? You might have the economic understanding, you might have the intellectual know-how, but without anything to import, export, or changes to that import and export system, what does your country have? The United States has other businesses, other things going on, very big financial economy, very big fashion industry. There are other things that operate independent of the continent of Africa. They have oil and access to oil in that region. The UK has other things going on. I think France would be the most upset because it'll directly impact their economy the most. But I think they would all be equally upset because they'll have less control over what's happening in that region. And financially, they all benefit somewhat in terms of businesses. Exxon, Mobil, many companies in the United States operate and get much of what they get from the continent of Africa. It would just make it more expensive there, but they would still be able to operate. So that's my belief system. France probably the most.
And I think it was Chirac or Mitterrand, one of those French presidents, said that France without Africa is...
He himself said it, right? I mean, and that's an important thing to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go back to the main topic of this interview, the West African drug trade. Can you tell us about it, please? Because This is something that is barely in the news. Maybe I heard that about Guinea-Bissau a long time ago, but you don't see in the news. Can you tell us how it started? Who could be behind the situation now?
Yeah, so I can say that since the 1970s, let's be very clear what we're talking about. So there are a couple of things that we could talk about. One is the opioid crisis that is happening across the continent of Africa, coming in from the East. There is an opioid crisis that is happening, and it's an issue. That usually opioids and is usually grown in Asia. However, that is not where the real issue is. The biggest issue is, and here's why, and opium and the opioids have a really bad impact on people in terms of what happens to them physically. Cocaine, for example, is seen as more of a recreational drug, very expensive to access. And it's mostly produced in Latin America. It is very difficult to go directly from Latin America to Europe. There's demand in Europe for cocaine, very low access to it in Europe. So to get from Latin America to Europe, it goes through West Africa. Many different ports and different ways it gets to Africa. And from there, it gets to Europe. So some individuals get exploited where they take balloons or cut off the fingers of gloves, pack the cocaine into that, tie it up, they swallow it, and they fly to these countries. And then, it passes through their system. And then they have to dig through their excrement to find it and then get paid by the individual dealers on the other side. So people are trafficking it through their bodies. I saw an article about a young Sierra Leonean that was caught in Australia with 71 of baggies that went through their system. 71. There was a movie called City of God, if I'm not mistaken, based on Brazil, and that was one of the things that she was swallowing those to go somewhere. They put themselves at risk for so many different things, and but mostly drug smugglers. So they exploit young for a way to get ahead in life, and they tell them a quick way to make $10,000, a quick way to swallow it and go. There are other processes that they go through putting it in vehicles, containers, all these other kinds of ways. I don't know all the different ways, because if all the ways were known, they would be stopping it. So there are ways that they don't know yet. They just know where it's coming from and where it's going through. There are many stories. I think I counted about 25 stories in the last 12 months in just one region of West Africa about drug busts that had happened for people in other countries who got caught bringing in cocaine. But it started in as early as the 70s. We don't know how much further back it goes. I don't know how big the business is. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. There's all kinds of talks about different folks who are major drug dealers who are hiding out in West Africa right now, continuing to run their operations, allegedly hiding out in West Africa, allegedly continuing to run their operations from there, but are indicted and or sentenced in their home. There's a story right now that I know about where there's an individual that was indicted. They said this person is expected to spend 24 years, and there was another 10 years in another country. It is alleged that this person is in Sierra Leone right now as we speak, living a free life under a new name, and he will not get extradited. If that is this person, which there's some disputes about whether it's the same person, the country of Sierra Leone would not extradite him to his home country, because there's no extradition treaty between these two countries. They're not required to send him back. And so they say this person has a lot of political influence. If it's the same person, they say this person may even be marrying into the family. This is all speculation. This is all alleged, but it is part of the overall story that is being discussed about the the drug trade through West Africa. And so the discussion basically is saying that people at the ports are bribed, and depending on what come into, depends on how much you need to bribe. But these people have plenty of cash to bribe them because they make so much money when it gets to Europe. One last thing I'll say is, you are away from the source, the more expensive it is, right? So if this stuff is grown and manufactured in Colombia to the United States, it may not be as difficult to get it to the United States. So what might be worth $80 to $120 in the United States, in the United Kingdom, that same amount might be worth $240 to $250 to $300 in the United Kingdom, right? And so imagine what that number might be in Australia. So these people are making so much money. And there are so many people involved in these processes. Nobody wants to stop the money train. And so it seems as though it's gotten bigger since the 70s, but that's when it started becoming on the radar of authorities, because in the United States, that's when the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, was launched. That's where some of these international groupings work together to try to pay attention to these things. So it may have been happening long before then, we don't know. But it seems as though when they started tracking it is when the late 70s into the 80s, the 90s, and then since then it's more sophisticated. But the people who are getting exploited are young Africans, and the people who are getting rich are Europeans.
And how long has Latin America used Africa as like a logistic point to the drugs in Europe?
That's what I'm saying. They're thinking from the 1970s. At least that's the first time it became on the radar of those who are reporting about it. We don't know if it's been before that. We don't know how long before that it could have been, but it seems like the 1970s is when it first became on the radar and it became reported. From my reading, that's what I found is the 1970s is when they started noticing it.
And what about the opioids? They come from Asia all the way to Africa.
Yes. Now that transfer of opioids from Asia to Africa, I'm not as aware of how, because I haven't really reported on this. There was a recent that was done. I'm just looking at it and see if I can find any details on this. But there's an estimated 4 million Nigerians abusing opioids right now out of the 225 million population. That's from the BBC. And so how is a question, because it's farther to travel. At least with Latin, you could just to Africa. I would imagine it's mostly through. There's a lot of shipping going back and forth around the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shipping containers. If you've ever gone in any country, you will just see tons and tons. Shipping container can be by government officials, and many are paid off to the other way. And so likely most of it is happening through shipping, and some version of it is happening through individuals with them in their bodies, risking their lives by swallowing it. But you're not going to be able to move large amounts that way. You're only going to be able to move smaller amounts that way. So it seems as though the shipping route is the way it generally happens, for amounts and large sums.
And I wonder how bad the problem is in Africa, because you know how many of our governments don't count on this kind of stuff, because many don't care, or they're just too naive. But 4 million Nigerians calculated to be on opioids, that's a long. That's a big number right there. And I think there is another drug it's like an herb. They chew it and they get high. I forgot the name.
I'm not familiar with that, but business across the business, and it has been for a long time. Heroin is that people talk the most, seems to have the most dramatic effect on people, but all the other opioids that come out of, there are different kinds of opioids. They make them in all that kind of stuff. There are many different types. It is starting to become a problem with pills in Africa for sure. That number from BBC, it's probably a rough estimate. Because it's fine. But if they're saying 4 million people, and for context, the city of Lagos, 9 million people registered to vote. So little less than half the people registered to Lagos would be, now Lagos versus the country, but less than that people saying they are aware for sure are addicted to.
Country in West Africa is the main as a logistic to distribute the drugs to Europe or to whatever.
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of different articles, stories about this. And generally, they say it's the biggest countries. So sometimes you hear Nigeria. Sometimes you hear some of these smaller countries are big hubs because it's easier. They say it's easier. This is what they say. It's like the reports will say it's easier to bribe officials in smaller countries. So, but I mean, from what I read, they do say Nigeria is one of them. And there are other countries too. Sierra Leone is another one that they mention, which is my home country. What I do, they don't say as much about Ghana, and I don't, because Ghana has really tried to crack down on this. Example, lived in Ghana. The building that I lived in was acquired from land a son of a drug dealer he had access to. His father went to many years. He was known as a cocaine dealer, and was bringing cocaine through Ghana and elsewhere. He is in jail for many years, 20 something years, if I'm not mistaken. And so son took over his land, and he sold all the land for his own personal gain, right? To make money, to move on with his life, and to be disassociated from what his father was doing. Or to reinvest, who knows? I don't know what he did with the money, but from what I understand, Ghana does tend to crack down a little bit more on these kinds of things. But that also might be for show. I don't know. But that's what I hear, is that the bigger countries tend to be the ones that they say are where these come through.
Joe, I would like to thank you for being with us tonight. And Absolutely. Thank you for your, I hope we can, continue to work, you for the English audience and for the Spanish audience, okay?
Absolutely. Okay. And I want to say thank you to you, by the way, for doing this interview. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time today.
No problem.
All right, can you guys hear me? So that was the interview with Analysis Africa, and they will be dubbing it and putting it out in Spanish, but I wanted to share it with you guys. So what do you guys think of the interview? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear what you guys thought. What do you guys think of my thoughts? Generally, I'm asking other people questions. So I think I like this format where I get a chance to share my thoughts and my knowledge and my understanding of things. So you get a chance to hear a little bit about where I'm coming from, as opposed to always hearing other people's thoughts. So if you guys like the fact that I will play some of these interviews that I do on other platforms here, let me know. If the interviews are shorter, I'm more likely to do reactions to those interviews and jump in and add my 2 cents here and there. But in this case, because I have a meeting immediately following, that I'm 15 minutes late for, I have to jump. But I hope you guys found this interesting and useful. If you did, make sure you give that thumbs up. If you know anybody who's interested in any of these topics, make sure you share this video with them. And if you haven't already, of course, make sure you subscribe on YouTube. It's Authentic African on everything. So with that, guys, I will be back next weekend. Next Sunday, I'll be back live for Exposing Sierra Leone. Next Monday, I'll be live with an interview on citizenship in Benin. I think we've talked about this a little bit, that there are countries offering citizenship now. We've talked about Sierra Leone, we've talked about Ghana, and now we're going to have a conversation about Benin. So I'm looking forward to doing that next Monday. Also, this week, we got a couple videos coming out that I want you guys to pay attention to. And I've already forgotten. And just those last couple of minutes. All right, so this week on the 12th, what's today, the 10th? So in 2 days, well, first of all, yesterday I just did my my first real estate video in Ghana. It's going to be a series of real estate videos. I think I got 7 that I'm doing. The first one went out yesterday. The next interview I'm doing is going to be from someone who moved from the UK back to Ghana to start a plant-based pharmacy, all natural herbs and stuff in the pharmacy, and a wellness center. So that's an interesting story. Then following that, I'll do another tour of a bunch of different apartments in Ghana. And then after that, I got Dre Taylor. And so that's the 12th, the 16th, and the 19th. Those are the next 3 videos that are coming out. So stay tuned to the platform. If you're interested in hearing stories of people who've moved to Ghana, that's what you're going to have. And then real estate about Ghana in the next couple of weeks. And then we'll be moving on to stuff pertaining to Sierra Leone immediately following that. I got a bunch of stuff that I'm going to do. And by the time I get my next trip, there'll be more content that'll be shot there. So with that, guys, I want to say once again, thanks for watching. Shout out to Pro Women saying great interview. Thanks so much, Joe. Hugs by everyone. Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope you guys did appreciate that interview. I'm more than happy to do more of them. As the more people want to interview me, the better. And I'd love to be able to bring those stories to you guys. So with that, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you all on the next video.